Hey guys, tonight we are wandering somewhere you probably didn't expect, into the flicker of candlelight in an ancient Siamese palace, where men in thin cotton robes hunch over bamboo tables, and their entire night is dedicated to a single, absurd task: counting rice grains. Yes, you heard that right. Not counting sacks, not bushels, not even jars. Counting rice. One. By one. You probably won't survive this if it were your real night shift. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The flame shivers against the wall, the wax dripping in slow rivulets down a clay candlestick. You sit cross-legged, half asleep already, watching a row of scribes scoop handfuls of pale grains onto polished wooden boards. Their fingers are nimble, moving like pickpockets in slow motion. The air smells faintly of oil, sweat, and dried husks. Someone sneezes, and instantly, the man next to him swats his shoulder in irritation. Because one sneeze could scatter an evening's tally into chaos. You lean closer, your eyes adjusting, realizing how strange it feels that the lifeblood of an empire is reduced to tiny specks rolling under candlelight. There's a quiet seriousness in this task. To you, it feels like punishment, the kind of thing assigned in a classroom as a prank. Count every grain, no breaks. But here, it's no joke. Rice is food, money, tax, and status rolled into one. Every grain matters. A single handful could mean a soldier's ration, or a widow's survival through the dry season. You start to sense the gravity. Kings in the Ayutthaya kingdom, centuries before Bangkok was even founded, believed precision here meant stability out there in the villages. It's boring, sure, but also deadly important. One of the scribes dips his brush into ink, his wrist steady as he scratches a character onto a palm leaf scroll. That mark is a line in the empire's balance sheet, a tiny piece of bureaucracy that will ripple outward to determine how much rice is owed, how many temples can be supplied, or whether the palace cooks will have enough for a festival. Imagine explaining to your friends that your big historical role was being grain counter, third from the left. Not exactly heroic, but without these guys, the whole kingdom might wobble. The room hums with the smallest sounds, wooden sticks knocking, rice grains pattering like soft rain, the wet scratch of ink on leaves. You try to match your breathing to the rhythm. A pile diminishes, another pile grows, and you almost feel hypnotized by the repetition. There's something soothing in the uselessness of it. Your mind drifts, wondering how many grains are in a single bowl. Maybe 7,000? If you had to eat your rice grain by grain, you'd never finish lunch. Somewhere, surely, a scribe tried to sneak one in his mouth and got caught. A fact floats into your ear. In the 14th century, when the Ayutthaya kingdom rose along the Chao Phraya River, rice was more than dinner. It was the backbone of trade and taxation. Unlike kingdoms built around gold or silver mines, this land of lush paddies measured wealth in food. The state needed ways to keep track, and counting, tedious as it was, became symbolic of order. It wasn't always literal grain by grain, but the ritual of exactness showed the king's grip on every harvest. Historians still argue whether kings ever personally sat down and touched the grains, or if that's just a legend to show diligence. But whether they did or not, people believed they could, and that was enough. You blink, and for a moment you catch a scribe licking his thumb to separate grains more quickly. His neighbor elbows him with a smirk, like, "Don't cheat the king." Quirky little tidbits drift into gossip. Some said monks warned that miscounting could anger rice spirits, bringing bad luck to the counters' families. Others whispered that if you dropped a grain and didn't pick it up, a snake would steal your wealth in the next life. Honestly, you'd probably just hope the candle went out so you could crawl away to bed. Still, you lean back, picturing how candlelight made this tedious work feel strangely sacred. Each flame symbolized the king's eye, watching through the night. Each tally was a whisper that the kingdom was safe, accounted for, and in balance. In that heavy quiet, the outside world shrank. Somewhere beyond these walls, farmers squelched through muddy paddies, oxen dragged plows, and cicadas screeched in the dark jungle. But here, only numbers existed. And you, unlucky traveler of history, get stuck watching it all. Your eyelids droop, matching the gentle slump of one scribe's shoulders. He pinches another grain, scratches another mark, and sighs like he's been sighing for 300 years straight. You almost want to nudge him, whispering, "Buddy, Excel spreadsheets are coming in a few centuries, hang tight." But of course, he wouldn't believe you. The monotony becomes its own music. Flicker, scratch, sigh. Flicker, scratch, sigh. You catch yourself slipping into the rhythm too, your mind drifting between boredom and peace. Maybe that's the point. In a world of war, storms, and famine, here's one thing utterly predictable. A grain is a grain, and tonight, someone will count them. You shuffle along behind a lantern bearer, leaving behind the scribes and their endless tally marks. The corridor is cool and echoing, lined with faded murals of elephants and mythical birds. When the doors creak open, you step into a cavernous chamber, and the smell hits first. Dry husks, faint mildew, a dustiness that clings to your tongue. This is the palace granary, the beating heart of the kingdom's pantry. You take a slow breath and realize how unnervingly quiet it is. Just the occasional scuttle of a rat you swear you didn't see, and the hollow drip of water somewhere far above. Your eyes adjust. Towering clay jars, taller than your shoulders, stand in rows like silent monks. Each one is sealed with a lid of woven reeds. The flicker of torchlight reveals white streaks of dust clinging to the floor, the residue of countless years of storage. You tiptoe, as if making too much noise might disturb the very math of the room. Because here, rice isn't just food. It's the kingdom's security deposit, its rainy day fund, its insurance against drought or siege. A fact drifts into your thoughts. Throughout Ayuthya's height in the 17th century, royal granaries stored vast amounts of rice as state reserves. When harvests faltered or war disrupted trade routes, these stores kept soldiers fed and temples supplied. Without them, even the strongest army could starve before the first battle. You imagine the weight of responsibility in those jars, every lid sealed not just grain, but months of survival. You trail a finger along one jar's side, feeling the rough clay ridges. A tiny crack zigzags downward, patched long ago with resin. You chuckle softly to yourself, because of course the king had wealth beyond measure. But even his storage jars looked like they'd survived a few clumsy accidents. Maybe some palace servant tripped over one, after sneaking a late-night snack. You can practically picture him begging forgiveness. "I didn't break the empire, I swear. It was just a jar." You drift past row after row, the silence pressing. Dust motes swirl in the torchlight like tiny spirits. Scholars still argue whether these palace granaries were primarily symbolic, displaying abundance for visitors, or genuinely practical, holding a fraction of the kingdom's rice reserves. Some accounts suggest most rice was stored in village barns, closer to the fields, safer from spoilage during transport. But here you stand anyway, surrounded by walls that give the impression of limitless food, even if the reality was more modest. It's theater and practicality blended, a royal magic trick built from sacks of grain. You pause, noticing how guards once stood here all night, spears tapping the floor to keep themselves awake. Imagine their boredom, staring at jars in the dark, listening for the sound of a thief's footstep. And for what? Steal one jar and you'd feed a family for months, but also sign your death warrant. A quirky tidbit floats in. Some tales said guards chewed betel nut until their teeth turned red, not just to stay alert, but to scare away any spirit that might haunt the rice. Apparently, nothing says ghost deterrent like blood-colored smiles in the torchlight. The air grows stuffier the longer you linger. You feel your eyelids grow heavy again, the scent of husks lulling you into a strange calm. Each jar is a drum of silence, a container of potential meals that never speak but weigh down the room with invisible gravity. You realize how every grain is a quiet note in a much larger song of survival. If one jar spoiled, it was more than lost food. It was a blow to the kingdom's rhythm. You wonder idly how many grains are sealed away in this hall. 1 million? 10 million? Enough to drive every scribe back in Section 1 absolutely insane if they had to count them individually. The thought makes you smirk. Maybe that's why kings kept the granaries locked. Less to prevent theft, more to save their staff from quitting en masse. You lean against a wall, and the cool plaster sends a shiver down your arm. For a second, you imagine the festivals where these jars were paraded into courtyards, lids popped open so citizens could marvel at the bounty. "Look," the king's message said without words, "I hold the stomachs of this land." It's political theater at its most primal. Forget speeches or monuments. Show people heaps of food, and they'll believe in your power. But there's a fragility here, too. Granaries can flood, rats can chew, fires can spark. The whole image of abundance rests on jars that are, in the end, just clay and straw. You picture a lightning strike setting the roof ablaze and the court scrambling, rice pouring out like sand in an hourglass. Historians still puzzle over how much rice was lost in disasters, and whether kings kept secret emergency stores elsewhere. Maybe this chamber is just one visible piece of a bigger network, the showpiece rather than the vault. You rub your eyes, the dust making them sting. The quiet presses harder until you hear your own heartbeat echoing. Standing here, you sense the strange contradiction. The room is boring, utterly static, yet full of invisible drama. Each jar is an unopened story of planting, harvesting, taxing, and hauling. Each lid hides the sweat of peasants, the scribbles of officials, the prayers of monks. And now, centuries later, you're just standing in the dark with a torch, realizing you're surrounded by more rice than you'd ever eat in your lifetime. Your stomach growls softly, and you chuckle. Imagine sneaking just a handful and cooking it in some palace corner. Would anyone notice? Maybe a few scribes would be up all night arguing whether the tally came out one handful short. Did we miscount? Or is the rice spirit pranking us again? You'd never admit you were the culprit. Best to stay a ghost, drifting through these halls, eyes open, whispering in the dust. The palace doors open to the wider world, and you find yourself following a dirt road lined with weary figures. Farmers, barefoot and sunburned, shuffle along in single file, each carrying baskets or sacks bulging with rice. The air smells of sweat, damp earth, and grain that has been dried just enough not to spoil. You squint at the procession, noticing how each step seems weighted not just with food, but with obligation. This is tax day in the kingdom, and every farmer knows the exact number of scoops he owes. The baskets creak on bamboo poles balanced across shoulders. Some men walk stiffly, backs scarred from years of the same burden. Women trail behind, clutching smaller baskets, children tugging at their skirts. The little ones glance nervously at the palace gates, as if they can sense the seriousness of this ritual. You edge closer and hear the shuffle of rice being poured into wooden tubs, the grains pattering like heavy rain. Officials squat beside the tubs with sticks, stirring and leveling each portion, checking that no farmer sneaks a hidden stone into the pile to make the weight look greater. The system is blunt, but effective. In exchange for protection, irrigation, and order, peasants surrender a portion of their harvest. Sometimes it's a tenth, sometimes more, depending on the king's needs. You picture the frustration on their faces after months of slogging through muddy fields, fighting off insects, and praying to rain spirits. A chunk of their rice vanishes into royal storage. Yet without it, the palace couldn't function, armies couldn't march, and temples couldn't hold feasts. Taxes are boring, yes, but also the glue that holds this world together. One mainstream fact comes to mind. In Siamese history, rice tax was so central that some regions measured obligations not in coins, but in baskets of unmilled rice. Records from the Ayutthaya kingdom mention assessments tied directly to land productivity, calculated in rice yields. Imagine the IRS knocking on your door today and demanding, not dollars, but neatly measured jars of jasmine rice. You'd need a forklift instead of a checkbook. As you watch, a farmer bows low, tipping his basket so the rice pours out in a pale stream. An inspector bends down, scooping a handful, letting it run between his fingers. He sniffs, tastes a grain, and nods. You try not to laugh at the image. It's like those wine-tasting connoisseurs, except the vintage here is plain boiled rice, vintage last harvest. Somewhere, you suspect one inspector swore he could tell the exact village a grain came from, the same way modern baristas brag about coffee origins. The farmers mutter among themselves. Some grin in relief after their pile passes inspection. Others grumble when told they owe more. A quirky tidbit drifts into your memory. In certain villages, people tried to outsmart inspectors by soaking their rice briefly in water before delivering it. Wet grains are heavier, after all. The trick worked, until the inspectors noticed moldy piles in the granaries and cracked down, threatening stiff punishments. You smile at the cleverness, then wince at the likely consequences. Historians still argue whether this system bled peasants dry or kept them in sustainable balance. Some suggest taxes were fair and adaptive, ensuring enough surplus for emergencies without crippling villages. Others insist the burden was crushing, driving farmers into debt bondage or forced labor. You glance at a boy beside his father, clutching a smaller basket, and wonder which version of history he experienced. Did he grow up secure, knowing his king protected him? Or did he go hungry while palace jars overflowed? The truth, like most of history, probably depends on which village you ask. The line of farmers stretches endlessly. You hear the rhythmic sound of scoops striking wood, inspectors chanting numbers under their breath, scribes scribbling furiously on palm leaves. The sun dips lower, throwing long shadows that make the baskets look twice their size. Somewhere a child cries, tugging at her mother's sleeve, but the mother shushes her gently. Better not to draw attention. Taxes may be routine, but they're also intimidating. You drift closer to one of the scribes, peeking at his record. His handwriting is a mess of looping lines, each entry a farmer's name tied to a number of baskets. You smirk, imagining him losing his place halfway through and pretending he didn't. Maybe he doodled in the margins to stay sane, sketching a fish or a flower between columns of rice tallies. Bureaucracy is timeless in its boredom. The smell of rice fills your nostrils again, warm and slightly sweet. You imagine the weight of all those grains combined, hundreds of thousands being shifted from peasants' hands into royal control. The sound of pouring never stops, a constant rustle like wind in dry grass. It lulls you, hypnotic and monotonous, until you feel your shoulders sagging as though you're carrying a basket yourself. You can't help but notice the quiet resentment under the surface. Farmers glance at each other, whispering jokes to lighten the mood. Maybe they complain about inspectors' picky habits. He says my rice tastes like swamp water. Has he even cooked before? Humor is survival, even here. One man sneezes dramatically, scattering a few grains, and the line behind him chuckles before quickly falling silent under the inspector's glare. By the time twilight deepens, the courtyard is carpeted with stray grains, crunching underfoot like gravel. You picture rats already planning their midnight banquet. The king's officials will sweep up what they can, but plenty will vanish into tiny stomachs before morning. Perhaps that's why taxes always feel heavier than they should. Somewhere between the baskets and the jars, little thieves, both human and animal, nibble away. You lean against a post, watching the last farmer dump his sack, sweat dripping from his forehead. He bows low, murmuring a prayer, and trudges home lighter but poorer. The courtyard empties, leaving only guards and officials. The tubs are full, the records inked, and the palace granaries waiting. Another cycle complete, another year of survival or struggle ensured. You sigh softly, realizing that boring as it seems, this routine was the heartbeat of an empire. You slip deeper into the palace, the rice tax procession fading behind you, and find yourself in a smaller chamber lit by narrow windows. The smell here is different: ink, wax, and faint smoke from oil lamps. At first glance, it looks almost like a classroom: low desks scattered with scrolls, sharpened bamboo pens, palm leaf folios stacked in neat bundles. But at the center, hunched over their tables, sit the men who quietly steer the kingdom's fate, royal record keepers. And at the far end, with his back straighter than the rest, sits the king himself. The king doesn't wear heavy armor or gleaming jewels here. Instead, He's wrapped in a plain robe, a thin golden sash draped across his shoulder, as if even majesty knows it must bow to arithmetic. His fingers tap lightly on the wooden table as a scribe reads out the latest figures. Baskets collected, granaries filled, villages that underpaid. The king's face is unreadable, but you sense the weight in his gaze. Every number is a decision. Who will eat? Who will tighten their belts? Which army garrison gets full rations? Which temple feast shrinks? You lean closer, noticing how the palm leaf scrolls are scored with lines, columns carefully etched to hold tallies. Some are written in neat looping characters, others in rushed scrawls. The room smells of concentration, the waxy tang of ink, the faint musk of sweat. Every so often, a servant pads softly to refill the king's cup with water. No one speaks unless spoken to. Silence is currency here, and numbers are power. A mainstream fact settles into your ear. In the bureaucratic machine of the Ayutthaya kingdom, rice wasn't just a crop. It was the state's ledger. Tribute, taxation, even corvée labor obligations were calculated in rice equivalents. The Royal Council pored over harvest records to forecast military campaigns and temple construction projects. Without these tallies, the king ruled blind. You watch his eyes narrow as he studies a scroll, perhaps noticing one district fell short. His hand twitches as if already preparing an order. Send inspectors, demand answers, restore balance. It's an oddly modern image. Royalty poring over spreadsheets, except the spreadsheet is a palm leaf and the mouse cursor is a bamboo pen. You almost want to lean over and whisper, "Your Majesty, in a few hundred years you'll have Excel formulas for this." But you bite your tongue. He probably wouldn't appreciate your joke about pivot tables, even if it would save him from hours of tallying. One quirky tidbit drifts in. Some chronicles mention kings performing ritual rice counts personally at year's end, not because they enjoyed the monotony, but as a symbolic show of diligence. Imagine a monarch bent over grains, while courtiers look on, whispering, "Our ruler is so meticulous, he counts his rice." Did he actually do it? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue whether these royal counts were literal or ceremonial. But the idea stuck, giving kings an aura of near magical patience. Back in the chamber, the scribes continue. One clears his throat nervously as he presents figures from a drought-stricken district. The king frowns, taps the table, and mutters a command. Immediately, a guard scribbles a note to dispatch more food from the reserves. You can almost see the math ripple outward. Subtract here, add there, balance restored. It's bureaucracy at its most human. Numbers representing lives. The air grows heavy with the rustle of scrolls. You notice one scribe shifting uncomfortably, his back aching. He drops his brush, smudging ink across a neat column, and gasps in panic. Quickly, he blots it with cloth, trying to erase the mistake. You stifle a laugh. Bureaucratic blunders are timeless, whether it's a smudge on a palm leaf or a typo in an email. His neighbor gives him a side eye that says, "Congratulations, you almost ruined the empire with one drop of ink." The king rises slowly, stretching his back. For a moment, he gazes at the assembled records, as if seeing not scrolls, but entire landscapes, fields swaying with green rice, farmers bent under the sun, oxen plodding through mud. You realize how strange it must be. To govern an empire you rarely touch directly, to feel it only through numbers on fragile leaves. That distance, that abstraction, makes the room seem at once powerful and fragile. You drift toward a window. Outside, the sky glows with late afternoon, the river gleaming in the distance. Barges float lazily, stacked with more sacks of rice, heading toward the city. Somewhere out there, families eat their evening meals, unaware that here, in this quiet chamber, the size of their next ration might be decided with the flick of a pen. The monotony creeps back. Scratch, murmur, scratch. Numbers pile up like sand. Your eyes glaze, and for a moment you imagine the figures themselves coming alive. Tiny rice grains crawling across the scrolls, rearranging themselves into armies, temples, villages. You blink, shake your head, and smile. Too much candlelight, too much counting. You're hallucinating bureaucracy, which is probably the dullest hallucination in human history. Still, the lesson lingers. The kingdom doesn't run on swords or elephants alone. It runs on ledgers, scrolls, and the patience to keep them balanced. You exhale, realizing that somewhere in the silence of numbers, an empire either prospers or falters. You wander from the ledger room, your ears still buzzing with the scratch of bamboo pens, and step into a lively courtyard where the scene feels completely different. Instead of solemn silence, there's chatter, laughter, and the clink of trade. Here, you see rice not just as tax or tally, but as money itself. Piles of grain are measured out on mats, scooped into jars, and handed off the way coins might change hands elsewhere. For the people of this kingdom, rice isn't just dinner, it is currency. A barefoot merchant squats in front of a customer, his hands moving quickly. He pours out a scoop of rice, then another, until the mound reaches an agreed-upon size. The buyer, a craftsman clutching a bundle of tools, nods in satisfaction. Payment made, no coins exchanged. You smirk at the simplicity. Instead of jingling silver in a pouch, people walk around with sacks of rice tied shut. You imagine trying that today, walking into a cafe, pouring half a kilo of jasmine rice on the counter, and asking for a latte. The barista would probably just stare at you. But here it works. A mainstream fact nudges your thoughts. For centuries across Southeast Asia, including in Siam, rice often functioned as a medium of exchange where coinage was scarce or inconvenient. Trade in local markets might rely more on grain than on minted money. Rice was divisible, storable, and universally valuable, qualities economists still list as ideal for currency. The only downside, try fitting a sack of it into your pocket. You lean against a pillar, watching as another transaction unfolds. A fisherman barters his catch of river carp, receiving jars of rice in return. He hoists them onto his shoulder, clearly pleased, though the grains spill a little with each step. You chuckle softly, imagining him explaining to his wife, "Sorry, dear. I brought dinner, but lost part of tomorrow's breakfast on the road." The clumsiness feels timeless. Currency is always slippery, whether it's paper bills flying in the wind or rice dribbling from a jar. Historians still argue whether rice truly replaced coins in everyday trade, or whether it was more symbolic, used mostly for tax and ritual, while silver and cowrie shells dominated marketplaces. Some say peasants rarely saw coins at all, living in a barter economy that revolved around rice. Others argue that rice's currency was more about royal propaganda than practical wallets. As you watch the exchanges around you, you suspect both sides are partly right. Rice was currency enough to matter, but not so convenient that people didn't long for coins. Nearby, a woman adjusts her basket, offering small pouches of spices in exchange for carefully measured scoops of rice. She's clearly sharp. Her hands move faster than the eye, and you half suspect she slips in an extra spoonful to herself before handing over the pouch. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some traders were rumored to sew hidden compartments into their clothing, pouring rice down their sleeves as savings. Imagine shaking hands with someone and hearing the faint rattle of grains sliding down their arm. Early banking, in a very crunchy form. The atmosphere buzzes with practical math. Children sit nearby, idly counting grains spilled on the ground, while elders argue about fair measurements. A dog wanders in, sniffing at the mounds, only to be shooed away by a merchant waving a stick. The whole courtyard feels alive, yet underneath the noise, there's a constant rhythm of scoops scraping against wood. It's strangely musical, the economy as percussion, rice grains as coins clinking in an invisible register. You close your eyes for a moment, trying to picture how it must feel to measure wealth in something you can cook and eat. On one hand, it's comforting. Your money is never useless, because you can boil it if needed. On the other, it's fragile. Leave your wallet in the rain and it sprouts. Try hiding it from thieves and you'll attract rats. Suddenly, modern credit cards don't seem so bad. Still, you can't help but admire the efficiency. When a farmer comes to buy cloth, he knows exactly how many scoops of rice it will cost. When a soldier wants a jug of palm wine, he pays with his ration. No need for coins that fluctuate in value, no worrying about counterfeit currency. Rice doesn't lie. It either fills your stomach or it doesn't. The sun glints off the grains, making the courtyard shimmer as if it's paved with pearls. You let your gaze wander, realizing the beauty hidden in monotony. Each grain, insignificant alone, becomes wealth when amassed. You remember the granaries, the tax tubs, the ledgers. Each step in this kingdom revolves around the same humble crop. Then you notice something amusing. A group of children are playing market at the edge of the courtyard. One pretends to be a stern inspector, demanding rice from the others. Another insists she's the queen, handing out tiny piles to her subjects. They laugh, tipping bowls of rice into the dirt, the game half serious and half chaotic. You smile, realizing even the youngest know that rice equals power, whether in games or reality. Your attention drifts back to the adults. A man argues loudly with a merchant, claiming he was shorted on his portion. The merchant defends himself, pointing to his measuring scoop. The two nearly come to blows before an inspector steps in, calmly remeasuring the rice. The crowd watches in silence. When the inspector declares the buyer correct, the merchant sighs, adds another scoop, and the matter is settled. Justice here is measured in grains, not lofty speeches. As dusk deepens, the crowd thins. Merchants pack up, tying their sacks with frayed rope. Stray grains crunch underfoot like gravel. The last rays of light glimmer on the emptying courtyard, and you exhale, realizing how much of life was negotiated through something so small and ordinary. Wealth, hunger, and trust, all reduced to a scoop of rice passed from one hand to another. The courtyard empties, and you follow the trail of merchants and farmers back inside the palace grounds, drawn by the rhythmic sound of wood against clay. At first it's faint, like a drum echoing through corridors, but as you approach, the clacking grows sharper, steadier, almost like a heartbeat. You round a corner and see them, the measuring tools of the kingdom, lined up neatly, guarded as carefully as swords. Here, wealth isn't counted with scales of silver or balances of gold. It's measured with scoops, jars, and sticks. A row of large wooden scoops rests against the wall, each carved to a standard size decreed by the crown. Inspectors lift them, fill them, empty them, testing for consistency. A scoop too large or too small could tilt the kingdom's balance, enriching one man while cheating another. You watch the seriousness with which they handle these humble tools, as though each scoop were a sacred relic. A mainstream fact drifts into your thoughts. Pre-modern Siam and its neighboring kingdoms developed intricate measurement systems for rice. Units like thang and sat were used, each linked to physical containers. Instead of abstract numbers, people trusted the tangible, a scoop, a jar, a basket. Measurement was law, and the tools themselves became symbols of royal authority. When a scoop was presented in the king's court, it wasn't just wood, it was legitimacy. You lean closer, watching an inspector dip a scoop into a jar, then level it off with a flat stick. The motion is precise, practiced, almost ritualistic. Grain spills over the rim, trickling back into the jar with a soft hiss. He repeats the process again and again, his face calm but stern. You smirk at the monotony, like a barista obsessively perfecting the foam on a latte, except here, the stakes are higher than a disappointed customer. One quirky tidbit drifts in. Villagers sometimes accused inspectors of shaving their scoops ever so slightly, sanding down the sides so the official portion grew smaller. A clever cheat, invisible unless you compared scoops side by side. To counter this, kings issued ceremonial scoops carved from bronze or even jade, displayed publicly so people could compare. Imagine walking into a marketplace today and seeing a giant golden measuring cup chained to a post, everyone nodding like, "Yep, that's the real standard." It's both ridiculous and brilliant. Historians still argue whether uniform measurements were widely enforced or just royal ideals that rarely reached remote villages. Some claim local lords manipulated their own tools, keeping peasants perpetually in debt. Others believe the king's inspectors traveled extensively, stamping out corruption with stern audits. The truth, as always, is probably a messy mix. Some villages played fair, others cheated, and most peasants just tried to keep their heads down. You drift past a table where smaller measuring cups are laid out. These are for everyday use. Households buying cloth, salt, or fish in exchange for rice. The tools vary wildly. One looks like a coconut shell, another like a hollowed gourd. You realize how deeply rice permeates life when even kitchen utensils double as currency counters. The line between cooking and accounting is blurred. Your dinner bowl might also be your tax scoop. A young apprentice sits nearby, sanding down a new scoop. His brow is furrowed, his hands careful. He pauses to blow away dust, then checks the curve against a master scoop, making sure it matches exactly. You grin at the irony. One careless shave, and he could invent inflation centuries before economists gave it a name. He doesn't look like he's ready to destabilize the kingdom, though. He just looks tired, dreaming of anything more exciting than sanding wood all day. The room itself smells of resin and sawdust, mixed with the faint sweetness of rice husks. Light slants in through high windows, catching the polished rims of metal scoops stored for ceremonial use. You let your gaze linger on one particularly ornate piece, engraved with lotus patterns. This one wasn't for markets or taxes. It was for show, paraded out during festivals to declare abundance. The king would hold it aloft, as if to say, "Here lies justice and plenty," one scoop at a time. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the steady clack of wood. The rhythm is soothing, almost hypnotic. Scoop, level, pour. Scoop, level, pour. You feel your shoulders relax, your thoughts slowing. Perhaps that's why the work could be tolerated. It lulled both worker and witness into a trance, a reassurance that order was maintained grain by grain. Then a loud sneeze snaps the moment. Grains scatter across the table, rolling onto the floor like tiny marbles. Everyone glares at the poor apprentice, who blushes crimson and hurriedly sweeps them up. You chuckle softly, remembering how back in Section 1, a sneeze was the mortal enemy of scribes. Apparently, sneezes have been sabotaging rice counts for centuries. Some things never change. As the light fades, inspectors store the scoops carefully, stacking them in rows, lids placed over the jars. The silence returns, broken only by the faint rustle of mice in the walls. You exhale slowly, realizing how much trust rested in these humble tools. Wars may have been fought with elephants and swords, but kingdoms were balanced with scoops and sticks. And now, as you drift further, you can't help but imagine a future archaeologist digging up one of these wooden scoops, scratching their head, and asking, why did they guard this like treasure? The answer, of course, is simple, because in its shallow curve lay the weight of a kingdom. The palace corridors give way to something brighter, louder, and far less serious than all those endless scoops and jars. You find yourself stepping into a wide plaza where drums pound, cymbals clash, and voices rise in a kind of controlled chaos. At first, you think it's a battle, but then you see the colors, the banners, and the absurdly tall piles of rice. Yes, rice, sculpted into glittering mountains that catch the sunlight like white gold. You've wandered straight into a festival of abundance. Here, the kingdom shows off not just its wealth, but also its stability. Farmers parade in with baskets perched on their shoulders, swaying under the weight of grains they've hauled from distant villages. Soldiers line the streets, not for war, but for crowd control, because when there's food on display, people press closer, desperate to touch or taste. You can almost smell the faint, nutty sweetness of cooked rice drifting in from nearby stalls, mixing with incense and sweat. A mainstream fact anchors the scene. Many Thai and Southeast Asian kingdoms held annual ceremonies where rice was displayed in massive quantities to signal prosperity. These events reassured citizens that the gods were pleased, the king was competent, and famine was far away. The spectacle wasn't just about food, it was about politics. You can practically hear the whispered message, "See, you're safe under this crown. Look at all this rice. Who would dare challenge me?" In the plaza, dancers move with deliberate grace, balancing trays of rice offerings on their heads. The grains spill slightly with every step, glinting in the air like glitter. Children laugh and chase after the fallen kernels, scooping them up as though each one were a treasure. You catch yourself smirking. Imagine calling dibs on rice grains like kids today call dibs on candy at a parade. Some things never really change, just the flavor of the prize. Then your eyes catch something stranger. In the center of the plaza stands a towering pyramid of rice, packed tightly into woven baskets, stacked higher than a man. Officials climb ladders to pour more grain at the top, ensuring it never looks smaller, always larger. It's like watching a never-ending magic trick. The crowd cheers each time a basket tips, as though the sight itself could guarantee another year of full bellies. Quirky detail. Time. Sometimes these rice pyramids weren't entirely rice. To keep the structure stable, organizers mixed in sand or husks at the base, layering good rice on top. From afar, the illusion was perfect, a towering mountain of white wealth. Up close, it was a little more questionable. You can't help but chuckle at the thought of someone sneaking a taste from the bottom only to crunch down on a mouthful of grit. Nothing says festive spirit quite like accidentally eating sand. Historians still argue whether these festivals truly reflected abundance or if they were more like theatrical distractions. Some scholars suggest kings staged the events during times of scarcity, piling up rice reserves from across the kingdom just to calm fears. Others believe the festivals followed genuinely plentiful harvests, honest celebrations rather than political cover-ups. You glance at the pyramid again, and the truth feels slippery, like trying to grab rice grains with sweaty hands. A group of drummers gathers near you, hammering out a rhythm that feels like a heartbeat under your ribs. The sound rattles the baskets, sending faint shivers through the pyramid. You notice a guard at the base, nervously adjusting the structure, muttering under his breath. If this thing collapsed mid-festival, the crowd would probably remember it forever, not as a promise of abundance, but as the day the king's rice mountain came tumbling down. It's a royal PR nightmare waiting to happen. Around the plaza, stalls offer cooked rice dishes for commoners, sticky rice wrapped in banana leaves, rice cakes sweetened with palm sugar, steaming bowls of rice porridge. The smell alone makes your stomach grumble. You laugh at yourself. Here you are, an invisible observer in an ancient kingdom, and you're jealous of a kid licking palm sugar off his fingers. Sleepy history lessons don't usually come with food envy, but here we are. A troupe of performers takes the stage, reenacting a myth where rice first came to humanity. You can't catch every word, but you recognize the arc: famine, divine intervention, and the generous goddess who gifts rice to mortals. The audience listens intently, nodding at the moral. Rice isn't just food, it's a blessing, something sacred. Watching the story unfold, you realize why every scoop and ledger feels so loaded with meaning. This grain carries both survival and spirit. The day stretches on, and torches begin to flicker as the sun sinks. Shadows stretch across the plaza, but the rice mountain still gleams, white against the orange sky. You imagine how many families contributed to this pile, how many hands planted, weeded, harvested, and carried. Behind the pomp lies real sweat, real backs bent under the sun. Yet the show transforms it all into spectacle, something citizens can point at and whisper, "See, we are strong." You edge closer, weaving through the crowd until you're right at the rope barrier. A little boy shoves past you, eyes wide, fingers sticky from candy rice. He stares at the mountain with awe, as though it were a dragon frozen in grain. His father ruffles his hair and says something you don't understand, but the tone is clear. Hope. The festival is more than spectacle. It's reassurance that tomorrow there will be food, and the next day too. Night deepens, lanterns glow, and the drums slow to a steady thump. The air cools, the noise softens, and people begin to drift home, leaving the pyramid standing silent under the stars. You take one last look, realizing how fragile and how powerful such displays can be. In the end, it's still just rice. But in that moment, it feels like the kingdom itself. The festival's echoes fade behind you as you wander deeper into the city, where the alleys grow quieter and the air smells of damp rice husks. Lanterns bob gently in the dark, and the laughter of children fades until all you hear is the shuffle of feet and the occasional creak of wooden carts. You follow the sound of boots on packed dirt, measured, steady, official. Ahead, a group of stern men stride with scrolls tucked under their arms and bamboo sticks in their hands. These are the royal inspectors, dreaded and respected in equal measure. They move like hawks, eyes sharp, voices clipped. Farmers stiffen when they appear, lowering their heads as if by avoiding eye contact they might avoid a fine. You trail behind, watching as the inspectors stop at a granary door. One bangs his stick against the wood, the hollow thump ringing out like a drum of judgment. A farmer emerges, bowing low, sweat gleaming at his temples. You can almost hear his heartbeat in the silence that follows. Here comes the ritual. An inspector dips his hand into a sack of rice and raises a small handful to his mouth. He chews slowly, eyes narrowing, then spits the grains out onto the dirt. The gesture isn't about hunger, it's about honesty. Good rice tastes clean, crisp, slightly sweet. Inferior rice, mixed with husks, sand, or worse, betrays the farmer. It's a simple test, but terrifying. Imagine paying your taxes today by handing someone a salad, only for them to pick through it with their fingers and declare you guilty of lettuce fraud. A mainstream fact grounds this. Historical Siamese administrations did employ officials to inspect and enforce tax collection in rice. Their duties weren't just to count, but also to verify quality. After all, what use was a warehouse full of rice if half of it was moldy or riddled with weevils? The inspector's word carried heavy weight. One accusation could ruin a farmer's reputation for years. Then comes a quirky tidbit. Some inspectors developed strange habits for testing rice. One account suggests they would roll grains between their fingers, listening to the faint squeak produced. Clean, polished grains made a clearer sound. Another trick involved dropping grains into a bowl of water to see which floated, since husk-filled or hollow ones bobbed to the surface. You picture a group of grown men leaning over bowls, flicking grains like kids playing marbles, while a farmer sweats bullets behind them. Not exactly the glamorous side of royal service. Historians still argue whether inspectors were diligent guardians of fairness or corrupt middlemen squeezing peasants. Some records paint them as noble enforcers, ensuring equal treatment across the land. Others hint at bribes slipped quietly into sleeves, a few coins or favors to overlook a shortfall. The truth likely varied, inspector to inspector. You watch one particularly stern official and wonder which category he belongs to, the incorruptible judge or the opportunistic hustler. The granary doors swing open, revealing rows of stacked sacks. Dust motes float in the lantern light, and the smell of husks and mildew fills your nose. The inspectors march inside, tapping the sacks with their sticks, listening for hollow spots. They cut one open, plunge in a scoop, and let the grains pour through their fingers. The sound is soft, like rainfall. You notice the farmer wringing his hands at the doorway, each scoop a gamble with his future. One inspector frowns and beckons the farmer forward. He points at a handful of rice that looks suspicious, slightly discolored, maybe damp. The farmer stammers, his voice shaking. You can't catch the words, but you recognize desperation in his tone. Perhaps it was an honest mistake, a sack stored too close to a leaky roof. Or perhaps he hoped no one would notice. Either way, the inspector doesn't look convinced. The tension breaks with a barked order. Assistants drag the sack aside, marking it with red paint. The farmer bows repeatedly, sweat dripping onto the dirt. He's not arrested, not yet, but the shame is public. Everyone knows which sacks failed inspection. You shift uncomfortably, feeling the weight of authority pressed into something as small as a grain. Later, you follow the inspectors into the marketplace. Here, the atmosphere is different, bustling, noisy, layered with smells of grilled fish and spiced soup. Yet the inspectors still command fear. Merchants scurry to present their scales and scoops, hoping they pass the test. One inspector pulls out a tiny bronze scoop, the official standard, and compares it to the merchant's wooden cup. The difference is subtle, almost invisible. But the inspector squints, measuring carefully. You grin at the absurdity. It feels like a medieval version of checking whether a gas pump delivers the exact liter it promises. Bureaucracy really is eternal. You pause at a fish stall, where the inspector tastes rice used as payment. He grimaces, spits, and shakes his head. The merchant protests, but the inspector's voice cuts through the market din. Sharp and final. People murmur, shaking their heads. The merchant looks furious, but powerless. Watching it unfold, you realize how delicate the balance is. Inspectors keep people honest, but they also keep everyone afraid. As night deepens, the inspectors retreat to a quiet pavilion to write their reports. Scrolls unfurl, ink brushes scratch, and the smell of resin lamps fills the air. Each inspector records names, amounts, judgments. You imagine a weary king reading these reports by candlelight, trusting that his empire's wealth has been measured accurately. The truth, though, might be filtered through fear, bias, or simple human error. You let your gaze drift upward, to the stars scattered across the night sky. The inspectors finish, roll up their scrolls, and tie them with string. Their faces are calm, unreadable, masks of authority. Tomorrow, they'll do it again, in another village, another granary. And the kingdom will keep turning, grain by grain, judgment by judgment. You sigh softly, amused by how something so small, rice between fingers, rice on a tongue, could wield such power. Then again, maybe it's not about the rice at all. Maybe it's about control, the reminder that someone is always watching, always counting. The thought lingers as you drift onward, leaving the inspectors to their endless rounds. The clatter of drums and the sharp voices of inspectors dissolve behind you as you follow another sound, softer and steadier, the faint shuffle of armor and the low murmur of bored conversation. You step into a long warehouse lined with thick timber beams, and immediately the air changes. It's heavier here, dense with the musty scent of husks and mold, the sour tang of damp wood, and the faint metallic tang of iron weapons. The smell alone makes your eyes water, but the men inside seem numb to it. These are the granary guards, silent sentinels of the kingdom's food supply. They lean on long spears, their armor dented and patched, their eyes half-lidded with fatigue. Some sit on low stools carved from stumps, chewing beetle leaves and spitting red juice into the dirt. Others pace slowly along the aisles, boots crunching on scattered rice grains that have slipped from sacks. You realize the absurdity of it all. Soldiers trained to fight wars with elephants and blades, reduced to babysitting bags of rice. But then you glance at the sheer volume stored here, row after row of sacks stacked to the ceiling, mountains of food capable of feeding thousands, and suddenly their presence feels less silly. A mainstream fact drifts in. Throughout Southeast Asia, royal granaries were guarded like treasuries because they were treasuries. In kingdoms where rice was wealth, to steal a sack was to rob the state. Guards ensured that thieves, or even ambitious officials, couldn't quietly slip a few baskets out under cover of night. Some records even note punishments as harsh as mutilation or exile for stealing from the royal store. You take one sniff of the dust-choked air and think, honestly, maybe exile would be a relief. You walk deeper among the rows. The atmosphere is strangely hushed, broken only by the rustle of rats darting between shadows. One guard stomps his foot, and a small cloud of dust erupts from the floor. He swears under his breath and adjusts the cloth tied around his nose. You grin. It's a universal truth that guarding food invites rodents, and these guards seem to fight a never-ending battle. Somewhere in the rafters, a squeak echoes. One soldier throws a rock upward, missing by a mile. His friends snicker. For all their stern posture, they're just men killing time on the most monotonous of shifts. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some granaries employed cats not just for pest control, but as semi-official mascots. A well-fed temple cat prowling the warehouse symbolized prosperity and divine protection. The guards often treated them as comrades, sharing scraps of salted fish. In one folktale, a cat supposedly foiled a thief by yowling so loudly that the entire garrison woke up. You can't help but chuckle at the thought of a furry little enforcer being more reliable than half-asleep guards slouched in the corner. Historians still argue whether the granary guards were elite soldiers trusted with a vital duty or simply the unlucky ones assigned to the kingdom's dullest post. Some evidence points to veterans being rewarded with relatively safe granary duty. Others suggest new recruits were dumped here until they proved themselves. Watching a guard try to balance his spear on his nose out of sheer boredom, you lean toward the unlucky post theory. The guards shift as the night deepens. One lights a torch and walks the perimeter, his shadow stretching tall against the sacks. The flicker of flame dances over the rice piles, turning the grains into glittering flecks. You realize how fragile all of this is. One stray spark, and the entire store could go up in smoke. Maybe that's why they stare so hard at every torch, their eyes following it like hawks. Fire is as dangerous an enemy as any invading army. You pause near a stack marked with red paint, spoiled rice pulled aside during inspection. The smell is foul, sour, and moldy, filling your lungs with heaviness. A guard waves you past, muttering about curses. People believed that rotten rice carried bad spirits, able to infect both body and soul. Some even whispered that sleeping too close to spoiled sacks brought nightmares. You glance at the guards bedding down on mats a few feet away and think, either they don't believe that, or they're too tired to care. Hours drag like centuries in the granary. A few guards start a dice game on an overturned crate, rolling bone pieces with hushed excitement. Another hums a song about a farmer who falls asleep counting grains, only to wake and find his hair turned white. You smirk. Sounds less like a myth and more like the lived experience of anyone stuck guarding rice for too long. You run your fingers along the coarse fabric of a sack, feeling the bulge of rice beneath. It's oddly comforting, soft, steady, grounding. You imagine peasants somewhere in the countryside eating their nightly bowls, unaware that soldiers sit here guarding the reserves that decide whether next year is feast or famine. The connection feels invisible but unbreakable. The farmer's sweat, the king's command, the guard's vigil, all woven into one fragile system. Outside, the wind howls faintly, rattling shutters. The guards pull their cloaks tighter, settling in for another endless watch. You yawn, lulled by the monotony, the rhythmic shuffle of boots, the soft squeaks of rats overhead. Perhaps that's the strange gift of the granary. It's boring by design. If nothing happens, it means the kingdom is safe, the rice is secure, and tomorrow will be like today. You take one last glance at the rows of sacks, the weary guards, the cats stalking the shadows. It's not glamorous, not heroic, but it is essential. Empires can rise with the clash of swords, but they survive because of men guarding sacks of grain in dusty silence. And in that thought, oddly enough, lies a kind of peace. The granary fades behind you, the smell of husks and rat droppings giving way to something drier, sharper, parchment and ink. You wander into a quiet chamber where the air feels brittle, like it might crumble if you breathe too hard. Here, shelves line the walls, stacked with scrolls and palm leaf manuscripts, their edges curled from centuries of handling. Scribes sit cross-legged at low desks, their brushes scratching in the silence, capturing not words of poetry, but numbers, cold and relentless. These are the drought records, the kingdom's memory of hunger. One scribe dips his brush and writes carefully, the year, the region, the rainfall measured by jars, the yield of rice counted in thang. His face is calm, but his back is stiff. He knows these records are no small matter. They tell the story of who ate and who starved. Every thin harvest is carved into these pages, like a scar. You imagine the weight of it, the way his hand must sometimes hesitate as he writes famine beside a village name. A mainstream fact settles in. Pre-modern Thai and Southeast Asian kingdoms did indeed maintain records of weather, floods, and droughts, often tied directly to harvest reports. These documents weren't just bureaucratic clutter, they shaped royal policy, tax adjustments, and even the rhythm of festivals. If the rains failed, the king had to act, redistributing rice from royal stores or risk revolt. In a way, the kingdom's stability depended as much on ink as on rice itself. The room is dry, but you swear you can almost taste dust and drought in the air. The scribe's ink strokes sound like brittle branches snapping. You lean over a scroll and see thin lines marking rainfall by month, tallies of rice yields dropping year by year. The script is small, almost anxious, as though by writing smaller they might conserve hope along with ink. Quirky tidbit for you. Some records weren't purely scientific, but included omens. A note might read, "This year, the moon turned red and the frogs sang late. The harvest was poor." It's half meteorology, half superstition. You smirk. Imagine modern climate reports mixing rainfall charts with, "Also 3 crows landed on a roof, so prepare for chaos." Maybe not so different from doom-scrolling weather memes today. Historians still argue whether these drought records were objective reports or political tools. Some believe scribes exaggerated scarcity to justify tax relief, painting the king as merciful. Others suspect the opposite, that they downplayed shortages to mask incompetence or avoid panic. The line between fact and spin blurs easily when survival itself is the subject. You drift further down the aisle, brushing your hand along scrolls stacked like loaves of stale bread. One is unrolled on a desk, the handwriting uneven, ink blotched. It describes a year of no rain until late season, when sudden storms flattened the crops. The scribe notes, "Many went hungry, many fled." The words are flat, almost clinical, but you feel the ache behind them. Families leaving their land, searching for food, carrying only hope. A sigh escapes you. Numbers on parchment feel safe, distant, but behind every tally lies a story. A child crying with an empty bowl, a farmer staring at cracked earth, praying for clouds, a village feasting on whatever roots they could dig up, while the king's scribes calmly wrote, "Shortage." You find yourself wishing those voices could bleed through the parchment, louder than the quiet scratch of ink. Across the room, an older scribe rolls up a finished scroll and places it gently into a bamboo case. His hands tremble slightly. Maybe he's written about famine too many times. Maybe he knows no matter how carefully he records the truth, the fields themselves will decide the kingdom's fate. He glances toward the ceiling beams, where a lizard clings upside down, chirping faintly. You wonder if he takes it as an omen, a reminder that nature has the last word. The chamber grows warmer as lamps burn low. Shadows stretch long across the scrolls, making the words blur. You think about the farmers who lived through these years, how the official records might condense their suffering into a single line, a single number. Harvest reduced by half. You almost want to laugh at the understatement. Imagine summarizing an entire year of struggle as neatly as checking a box on a form. Bureaucracy has always been ruthlessly efficient at erasing pain. One scribe coughs, the sound dry as straw. He pauses, dips his brush again, and resumes. You watch the movement of his hand, slow, deliberate, resigned. He's not creating art. He's building memory, grain by grain, line by line. And though the ink may fade, the rhythm endures, a faint echo of hunger whispering through centuries. Outside, thunder rumbles faintly. You smile at the irony, writing of drought while the sky threatens rain. A guard steps to the doorway, glances upward and mutters something under his breath. The scribes barely look up. They've recorded too many storms, too many false promises of rain. Still, you feel the cool air shift, carrying the scent of wet earth, as though the kingdom itself is exhaling. You leave the chamber quietly, the scribes still scratching away, their ink binding history into lines no thicker than a rice stalk. Behind you, the doors creak shut, sealing the records in darkness. And yet the memory of famine lingers with you, a reminder that even in a land of abundance, hunger is never far away. The scratch of brushes fades as you slip out of the archive chamber, and the silence of the palace grounds presses in again. But it isn't long before you catch another sound, quieter still, murmurs, half-whispered, as though people are afraid the air itself might overhear. You follow them into a narrow alley where villagers crouch around a small fire, hushed and serious. They aren't telling ghost stories, not exactly. They're talking about numbers, specifically the dangers of counting rice grains the wrong way. You ease closer, listening. One woman insists, that miscounting rice isn't just a matter of sloppy math. It's an invitation to curses. If you skip a grain, she says, the spirit of the harvest notices, and that spirit doesn't like being cheated. The others nod, solemn. You blink, fighting the urge to laugh, because imagine being haunted for losing count of something so small. But in a world where every grain means survival, maybe superstition is just another way of taking the numbers seriously. A mainstream fact grounds you. In Siamese tradition, rice wasn't just food, but also sacred, tied to May Phosop, the rice mother goddess. Farmers believed she dwelled in every grain, blessing harvests and punishing disrespect. Rituals often accompanied planting and harvesting, and careless treatment, like spilling rice or miscounting it, could be seen as dishonoring her. Suddenly, the whispers around this fire don't sound so silly. They're reminders that math and faith were intertwined. One man stirs the fire with a stick, his eyes darting toward the sacks stacked nearby. He tells a story of a clerk who once tried to count rice too quickly, skipping handfuls to finish early. That night, his storehouse was overrun by rats. Not one or two, but hundreds, pouring in like a living carpet. The villagers lean forward, eyes wide. You can't help smirking. Of course, in a damp granary, rats are hardly supernatural. But the man swears it was May Phosop's wrath, punishing dishonesty in arithmetic. It's both terrifying and oddly specific. Quirky tidbit time. In some villages, children were warned never to play games that involved counting rice grains. Parents claimed it distracted May Phosop, who might take offense and reduce the harvest. Instead, children were told to play with pebbles or shells, less sacred, less risky. Imagine being scolded for making up a game of rice tic-tac-toe because you might doom the entire village. Childhood wasn't exactly carefree when every kernel carried cosmic weight. Historians still argue whether these superstitions truly shaped policy or were just private village traditions. Some claim kings themselves honored May Phosop with official rituals, blending governance with reverence. Others believe royal records stripped away such beliefs, focusing only on practical measures like scoops and sacks. You picture a king trying to run a census while priests insisted on appeasing rice spirits, and you can see why historians debate it endlessly. The truth is likely tangled. Official records on one side, whispered fears by the fire on the other. The villagers keep trading stories. Another woman recalls how her grandmother counted rice grains one by one during a famine, praying aloud with each number. When she reached the end, she found a few extra grains in her palm, as though the goddess had slipped them in. The group murmurs approval, treating it as proof that counting isn't just arithmetic. It's a kind of prayer, a way to invite blessings. You shiver slightly, not from fear, but from the thought of math becoming magic. You glance at the sacks behind them, shadows stretching across the cloth. Each one holds thousands upon thousands of grains, each grain supposedly housing a spark of divinity. No wonder the act of counting feels sacred. Imagine tallying up tiny deities all night, afraid that if you miss one, you'll insult the heavens. Suddenly, those palace clerks bent over ledgers seem less like accountants and more like nervous priests. The fire crackles low. One man tosses in a husk, watching it curl into ash. He says softly, "Every number has a spirit. Every spirit has a price." The others nod, thoughtful. For them, counting isn't sterile. It's a dangerous negotiation. you can't help but reflect on how different modern life feels. Today, you spill rice on the kitchen counter, sweep it up, maybe curse at the mess. Back then, spilling a grain might make you glance nervously over your shoulder, waiting for divine retribution. A sudden gust of wind scatters a few grains from a sack. They bounce across the ground, glowing faintly in the firelight. Instantly, the villagers lunge forward, scooping them up, murmuring apologies to the darkness. Their urgency is almost comical, yet entirely sincere. You smirk, thinking, this is probably the only time anyone has treated rice like runaway lottery tickets. The night deepens. One by one, the villagers rise, bow to the sacks, and slip into the shadows. The fire dies down, leaving the faint smell of smoke and husks. You linger a moment longer, letting the superstition settle in your mind. Maybe it's silly, maybe it's fear, but maybe, in a world where hunger always loomed, treating numbers as sacred was the only way to make survival feel less random. As you move away, the silence wraps around you again. The sacks sit still, the grains inside resting like countless tiny gods in the dark. And you wonder, if you had to count them, would you dare risk losing track? Or would you whisper a prayer with every number just in case someone or something was listening? You drift onward from the hushed firelight, the whispers about curses fading behind you. Soon, the sound of a marketplace swells, pulling you into the rhythm of trade. Clattering wooden carts rattle across uneven stones. Vendors call out their prices with lungs full of dust and determination. And everywhere you look, rice shifts hands, measured, weighed, and all too often, manipulated. Because here in the kingdom's markets, honesty is optional, and cheating scales are an art form older than the temples themselves. You watch a wiry merchant set a balance scale on his stall, the kind with 2 hanging pans and a set of carved wooden weights. A farmer pours a scoop of rice into one pan, and the merchant places a chunky block in the other. The scale tips slowly, too slowly, as though the universe itself is sighing at the fraud. The farmer squints. You squint. That block is hollowed out, shaved on the underside, lighter than it looks. The merchant pretends not to notice, sliding the farmer's rice into a sack and tying it with a neat bow. One more customer, one more quiet victory in the eternal war between buyer and seller. Mainstream fact. Across Southeast Asia, cheating scales was such a common problem that kingdoms, including Ayutthaya in Thailand, passed regulations to standardize measures. Official royal weights were carved in stone or cast in metal and kept in palaces or temples, supposedly immune to tampering. Inspectors would travel with these master weights, checking markets, fining merchants whose balances didn't match. But enforcement was tricky. Inspectors were few, merchants were many, and bribery was as natural as humidity in the tropics. You wander deeper into the market, nose catching a blend of spices, smoke, and sweat. A boy hustles past carrying a sack of rice bigger than himself, stumbling under the weight. You glance at another stall and notice a different trick, a scoop with a thick bottom. The hollowed interior holds less than it seems, so every measure comes up short. It's sleight of hand with kitchenware. You can almost imagine the merchant winking at you, whispering, "Don't hate the player, hate the scoop." A quirky tidbit. Some merchants supposedly trained parrots to squawk misleading phrases. "Best weight, honest weight," whenever a customer hesitated. Imagine haggling with a bird heckling you into compliance. You'd probably just throw an extra coin and hurry away, half annoyed, half impressed. Historians can't confirm this practice, but folklore suggests the line between entertainment and fraud blurred easily in these bustling markets. Historians still argue whether the monarchy genuinely believed it could eliminate fraud or merely staged inspections for appearances. Some scholars say kings used cheating scales as a convenient scapegoat, blaming dishonest merchants for shortages rather than flawed royal policy. Others argue the inspections were sincere but undermined by corruption at every level. You picture a stern inspector lugging around the official bronze weight while quietly pocketing a bribe of rice cakes behind the stall. It's bureaucracy with a snack break. You stop near a group of farmers unloading baskets, their faces weary from the fields. They grumble about being cheated but shrug as if it's inevitable. One says, "Better to lose a handful than lose the whole harvest." It's a kind of resignation, a recognition that markets tilt as much as scales. You wonder how many sleepless nights these farmers endured, tallying their losses like invisible debts owed to fate. The clamor of the market sharpens in your ears. Bargaining, laughter, the thud of sacks hitting wood. A merchant holds up a shining scoop, claiming it's certified by the palace. The crowd chuckles, skeptical. You lean closer, curious. The scoop has tiny etchings along its rim, symbols of lotus petals. They look official, but the lines are crooked, clearly forged. And yet, the performance matters more than the truth. Customers see a mark, they relax, and coins jingle into the merchant's pouch. Fake stamps, fake comfort, real profit. A nearby woman adjusts her scarf and mutters about karma, saying cheaters will pay in the next life. But she still buys her rice with a sigh. Faith is cheaper than rice, after all. Another man points to a shrine tucked at the edge of the market, where incense curls upward. Merchants light sticks of incense before starting the day, asking for forgiveness in advance. It's a kind of cosmic insurance. Cheat today, pray tomorrow. Balance restored, at least in their minds. You smirk, realizing how universal this feels. Ancient Siam had its tricksters, its loopholes, its half-hearted enforcement. Today, you complain about hidden fees, misleading ads, and subscription trials that never end. Back then, it was hollow weights and lopsided scoops. Different props, same performance. Humanity just keeps inventing new ways to shave off a little extra for itself. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the market. The stalls quiet slightly, and you notice inspectors finally arriving. Their robes are crisp, their voices sharp as they demand scales for testing. The crowd hushes, tension rippling outward. One inspector drops the official bronze weight into a pan, watching the merchant's balance wobble suspiciously. Gasps ripple. A fine is declared. The merchant wails dramatically, tearing his shirt for effect, swearing he never cheated. The crowd mutters. Some are sympathetic, others smug. You sense it's part theater, part justice, and entirely exhausting. As dusk falls, the market shudders slowly. Merchants sweep stray grains into their palms. Farmers sling lighter sacks than they expected, and you're left wondering who really won today. Was it the inspectors with their bribes, the merchants with their tricks, or the farmers who managed to get at least something home? The truth, like the balance scales, tilts depending on who's holding the weights. You step away, your ears still ringing with the parrot's imagined cries. Honest weight, honest weight. And you can't help chuckling. Because whether in ancient Siam or your local supermarket, the same rule applies. If a deal feels too light, it probably is. The marketplace fades behind you, and now the creak of wooden wheels drifts into earshot. Lanterns swing gently on tall carts, illuminating sacks piled high like miniature mountains. You follow the caravan as it rattles out of the city gates, the smell of husks and straw trailing in the air. This is no ordinary grain delivery. This is diplomacy on wheels, rice turned into tribute, gift, and bargaining chip. You realize you're about to watch kingdoms negotiate not with swords, but with supper. The road stretches wide, carved by centuries of trade. Soldiers walk alongside the carts, spears glinting in moonlight. Their armor clinks softly, but their eyes are watchful. Rice shipments are wealth in motion, and thieves love nothing more than a wagon full of edible treasure. One guard jokes half seriously, "If bandits catch us, they won't eat us. They'll just eat the rice." You chuckle under your breath, imagining a gang of robbers tearing open sacks, feasting on raw kernels like deranged pigeons. Not the most cinematic heist, but hunger makes everything dramatic. Mainstream fact. Throughout Southeast Asian history, including in Siam, rice wasn't just a staple food. It was a unit of political value. Tributary states often sent rice to the central kingdom as a sign of loyalty, while Siam itself dispatched rice to neighboring powers as diplomatic offerings. Records from the Ayutthaya period note carts of rice sent to cement peace treaties or to curry favor with Chinese and Khmer courts. Grain was more than calories. It was credibility, an edible handshake. You trail behind the caravan until it halts near a riverbank, where boats wait with wide bellies ready to carry the cargo downstream. Officials step forward, unrolling scrolls, checking counts, and sealing sacks with wax and rope. The river glimmers under torchlight, a highway for diplomacy. You feel the breeze off the water, cool against your face, and think, this is politics reduced to grains and knots. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. In some accounts, foreign envoys who received Siamese rice were expected to cook and eat a ceremonial bowl in public. Refusing would have been a grave insult, implying the rice wasn't good enough to share one's body with. Imagine being an ambassador, stomach rumbling, forced to choke down a bowl of slightly undercooked sticky rice while everyone watched your chewing technique. Diplomatic tension measured in bite sizes. Historians still argue whether these rice exchanges were primarily symbolic or genuinely vital to survival. Some argue the rice tributes were pageantry, staged to show off abundance, since elite courts hardly lacked food. Others insist that in lean years, tribute rice meant real sustenance, a cushion against famine. You picture a royal court pretending the rice is just for display, while quietly thanking the gods for the extra calories in the pantry. The caravan master waves, and the first boat is loaded. Men carry sacks 2 by 2, muscles straining, sweat gleaming under the torches. The air hums with effort, but also with importance. This rice isn't just grain anymore. It's a promise in burlap, a pact that says, "We come in peace." Somewhere upriver, another court waits, eyes sharp for the sight of those sacks. They will judge Siam's strength not by soldiers or monuments, but by how neatly the rice arrives. As you watch, you remember something from the market, the crooked scoops, the shaved weights. Suddenly you wonder, were these tribute shipments entirely honest? Did merchants sneak lighter sacks into the loads, hoping no one would notice? Did kings pad their tributes with chaff? Historians whisper that some shipments were fluffed with extra husks, the outer shells of rice grains, to make the sacks look fuller. If that's true, diplomacy sometimes boiled down to, here, take this grand gesture, mostly husk, partly food. The boats push off, oars slicing water in unison. The night feels alive with anticipation. You trail along the bank, listening to the splash of paddles and the creak of cargo. It's oddly soothing, like the kingdom itself is breathing slowly, exhaling rice toward its neighbors. You imagine the receiving court untying the sacks, letting grains spill through their fingers, judging alliances by texture and scent. Who needs flowery treaties when you can sniff your way to trust? One soldier near you mutters about the journey. Better rice than silver, he says. Rice doesn't tempt demons like coins do. You smirk at the thought of demons shaking down tax collectors, but politely ignoring sacks of sticky rice. Honestly, if you were a demon, you'd probably feel the same. The boats glide deeper into the night, torches shrinking to dots. You pause at the river's edge, reflecting. This isn't just logistics. This is a ritual of trust. Kings risked sending food far from home, trusting it would return as peace, not as weakness. And in that risk, you sense the heartbeat of diplomacy, the constant gamble that generosity might buy safety longer than swords ever could. The night air cools, the river quiets, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing down, heavier than any sack of rice. The kings counted grains not only for taxes, not only for granaries, but to know how much they could spare for diplomacy without starving their own people. Every shipment was a calculation, a delicate balance between generosity and survival. And now, as the river carries those sacks away, you see rice not as food, not as math, but as a message written in the simplest language. Abundance means peace. Scarcity means danger. The night on the river fades, and when you next blink, you find yourself stepping into the glowing interior of a royal hall. The air here is thick with incense, the sweet smoky smell wrapping around you like silk. Golden chandeliers sway gently, candles dripping wax in steady rhythm, while servants scurry past with trays stacked precariously high. The hush of diplomacy has given way to the hum of spectacle. You've arrived at one of the king's banquets, and if you thought rice was humble peasant food, think again. Here, it becomes theater. Your eyes drift across the hall. Long wooden tables stretch out like river banks, covered in cloth embroidered with lotus and naga patterns. On those tables, instead of silver coins or glittering jewels, you see pyramids, yes, literal pyramids, of rice. Each one polished and steamed until the grains glisten like tiny pearls. Some piles are shaped into animals, elephants with tusk-like spoons stuck in their sides, birds with wings carefully crafted from banana leaves, and even one poor crocodile whose scales are, well, just sticky rice lumps. Still, the artistry impresses. This isn't about eating. It's about announcing prosperity so loudly that every guest feels full before the first bite. Mainstream fact. In the Ayutthaya court, banquets often doubled as political performances. Rice wasn't merely served in bowls, it was displayed as abundance, proof that the kingdom was flourishing. European visitors from the 17th century described feasts with hundreds of dishes, rice mounded high to signify wealth and divine favor. To host such events required granaries full enough to spare thousands of grains for showmanship, a flex of royal arithmetic. You walk closer to a table and notice nobles dressed in silk leaning toward the pyramids. They don't look hungry. They look like mathematicians disguised as party guests, quietly calculating how many farmers' backs went into building these mountains. A nobleman chuckles and whispers, "The king feeds us with numbers, not rice." You grin at the irony. A banquet isn't just dinner, it's propaganda with chopsticks. Servants appear with golden ladles, carefully spooning from the rice pyramids into smaller bowls. The first scoop is slow, ceremonial, meant to release steam into the air like incense from a sacred vessel. You can almost hear the grains whispering, "Look how plentiful we are." Guests bow their heads before tasting. For a moment, silence reigns, then soft hums of approval ripple through the hall. Quirky tidbit. In some records, nobles were so competitive about banquets that they tried to outdo one another with rice sculptures. One infamous example supposedly featured a full-sized rice throne that collapsed under its own stickiness midway through the feast. Imagine sitting in sticky rice for the rest of dinner, pretending nothing happened. Now that's commitment to royal hospitality. Historians still argue whether these banquets were wasteful displays or clever investments. Some claim mountains of rice were obscene, especially during years when peasants went hungry. Others argue the opposite, that such feasts reassured subjects, convincing them that the kingdom's granaries overflowed, even if reality was thinner. Was it theater hiding scarcity, or abundance flaunted shamelessly? The answer probably depends on where you were seated, at the king's table or in the mud of the fields. You wander farther into the hall, weaving between guests. The clatter of chopsticks, the murmur of polite compliments, and the occasional cough from someone who swallowed too quickly blend into a soothing rhythm. At one table, a noble brags about the magical rice served tonight, claiming it has healing powers. You lean in, curious. Turns out the rice was simply soaked in jasmine water. Healing? Maybe not. Aromatic? Absolutely. The noble swears his knees feel younger already. You roll your eyes but let him enjoy his placebo. At another table, foreign envoys stare at the rice pyramids with wide eyes, unsure how much to eat. They nibble cautiously, trying not to look greedy. One envoy whispers to another, "If we take too much, do we offend? If we take too little, do we offend?" You stifle a laugh. Diplomacy by spoonful is an underrated art. The king finally appears, gliding into the hall with a calm presence. His robes shimmer, embroidered with patterns of rice stalks swaying in the wind. He doesn't need to speak much. The feast speaks for him. Every grain says, "I control the harvest. I control survival. I am your king because I count and provide." The nobles bow, the envoys bow, even the servants freeze in reverence. And you, though invisible, feel yourself bowing slightly too, caught in the gravity of spectacle. The music swells, flutes, drums, a slow rhythm that feels like a heartbeat. Dancers in golden masks enter, their movements imitating the sowing and harvesting of rice. Each step represents planting, each twirl a harvest. It's mesmerizing, a performance turning farming into art. You notice the nobles watching, smiling faintly, some clapping in rhythm. The symbolism is heavy. The kingdom is fertile, the gods are pleased, and the king is the conductor of this great agricultural orchestra. But you can't ignore the quieter details. A servant sweeps a few spilled grains from the floor. almost frantic to gather them all. Another rushes past with a tray, the pyramid on it wobbling dangerously. The spectacle is grand, but fragile, dependent on endless work behind the scenes. You feel a flicker of sympathy for the unseen hands propping up this illusion. The night deepens, torches flicker, and the last bowls of rice are served. Guests lean back, satisfied, or at least pretending to be. The pyramids shrink slowly until they are piles of scattered grains. The king rises, signaling the end. Everyone bows again, the air filled with a strange mix of awe and relief. As you step away, you realize something. The banquet was never about taste. It was about reassurance, control, and power measured in calories on display. Rice didn't just fill stomachs here. It filled gaps in loyalty, confidence, and faith. And though the pyramids will be gone by morning, their message lingers like incense in the air. Prosperity, whether real or staged, keeps kingdoms standing. The torches in the banquet hall sputter out behind you, and as you step away, the air cools and grows quieter. The silk-robed nobles, the rice pyramids, the dancers, they fade like a dream, replaced by the stillness of temple courtyards. Moonlight falls across stone steps, and the smell here is different from feasts or markets. It's sharper, cleaner, incense curling upward, mixing with the faint aroma of jasmine blossoms. And here, rice isn't sculpted into grand pyramids for nobles to applaud. It sits humbly in bowls, laid gently at altars, a gift not for people, but for gods. You walk past rows of clay bowls placed on temple platforms. Each is filled with neat mounds of rice, some plain, some sprinkled with sesame seeds, others tinged golden with turmeric. The bowls line up like quiet soldiers, forming a procession toward statues of Buddha and guardian spirits. The grains glisten faintly in the candlelight, as though they too are alive, waiting for unseen hands to claim them. Mainstream fact: offerings of rice to temples were a cornerstone of Buddhist practice in Siam. People believed that giving food, especially rice, the essence of life, created bun or merit, which would improve one's fortunes in this life and the next. Every morning, monks walked through villages collecting rice in their alms bowls, and households, no matter how poor, tried to contribute at least a handful. The act was not about feeding monks, though it did, but about feeding faith itself. You picture families rising at dawn, scooping warm rice from steaming pots, placing it carefully into monks' bowls without tasting it themselves first. Hunger wasn't an excuse. The ritual mattered more than comfort. Parents would nudge sleepy children awake, teaching them that each grain offered was a ticket toward a kinder rebirth. And you realize, once again, rice wasn't just calories. It was currency with the cosmos. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. In some temples, people used to count exactly 108 grains of rice for special offerings. Why 108? Because in Buddhist tradition, that number symbolizes earthly temptations and the paths to overcome them. Imagine carefully plucking out grains, one by one, to hit the exact total, knowing that if you accidentally offered 107 or 109, you might throw off the spiritual math. Tedious? Absolutely. But in a world where eternity was at stake, precision mattered. Historians still argue whether these practices were primarily personal devotion or subtle acts of social control. Was merit-making truly about spiritual growth? Or did the temple system use it to reinforce loyalty, reminding people daily of the cosmic order that mirrored the king's authority? Some scholars lean toward the idea of heartfelt faith. Others see political utility. You stand in the courtyard, gazing at the neat bowls, and realize the truth is layered like the rice itself, sacred above, practical below. You watch as a group of villagers shuffle in quietly. One man sets down a bowl with trembling hands, whispering a prayer for rain. A woman follows, bowing 3 times before carefully adjusting her rice mound so it looks tidy. A young boy tries to sneak 1 grain into his mouth before placing the rest on the altar, earning a swift flick on the ear from his mother. You stifle a laugh, because yes, even in the middle of solemn devotion, kids will be kids. The temple bells toll softly, and monks in saffron robes file in. Their heads are shaved, their steps deliberate, their expressions serene. They gather the offerings slowly, not rushing, as if each bowl deserves the full weight of their attention. You notice how villagers watch eagerly, almost hungrily, as if the simple act of a monk accepting their rice validates their prayers. It's a quiet transaction, grain for blessing, devotion for reassurance. You wander further inside, into a darker chamber. Here, rice offerings are smaller but more intricate. Some are mixed with flowers, others pressed into tiny cakes, shaped like lotus buds. One offering has been dyed red, likely with hibiscus, symbolizing vitality. You imagine the hours spent preparing them, the care poured into making something beautiful, only for it to vanish into the mouths of monks, or into the bellies of temple birds. It's devotion measured in time as much as in grains. A novice monk kneels near a statue, arranging offerings in symmetrical lines. You lean closer and notice he mutters as he counts 1, 2, 3. Each number seems like a mantra, an act of focus. You think back to those palace scribes hunched over ledgers and realize the connection. Whether for taxes or temples, counting rice always had weight. Practical in one place, spiritual in another. Numbers mattered everywhere, but the meaning changed depending on who was watching. The night air outside grows cooler, and you step back onto the courtyard. Torches flicker low, fireflies dart in lazy arcs. A group of dogs lies sprawled near the temple gate, bellies round from licking up spilled offerings. You grin, thinking, well, at least somebody's enjoying the cosmic buffet. It's a reminder that even sacred rituals can have very down-to-earth beneficiaries. The villagers slowly disperse, their bowls empty, their steps lighter. You can almost sense their relief, as if unloading those grains also unloaded their worries. They return to their homes, convinced that their offerings will ripple forward into blessings. And you, still standing in the courtyard, find yourself oddly calmed, too. The temple bells ring once more, long and low. The sound vibrates in your chest, blending with the scent of incense and the faint shimmer of rice left behind. It's all simple, almost boring, yet in that simplicity lies a kind of peace. Grain by grain, offering by offering, lives were measured, balanced, and given meaning. You exhale slowly, feeling the rhythm settle into you like a lullaby, the quiet arithmetic of faith. The temple bells fade into the distance, and the incense smoke dissolves into the night sky. You take a step forward, and suddenly the air thickens with humidity. Clouds hang heavy, sagging with unspent rain. Your sandals squish into soft earth, and the sound of rushing water hums faintly in the background. You realize you've arrived in one of those years when the rivers don't just feed the fields, they swallow them. The chronicles speak often of floods, and now you're wading into those pages. Before you even see the water, you hear it. The endless roar of swollen rivers bursting their banks, surging over dikes, slamming into wooden huts with an anger that feels almost deliberate. The sound is constant, a low growl punctuated by crashes as whole chunks of soil collapse into the current. You glance to the side and watch farmers scrambling to save what they can, grabbing sacks of rice before the tide claims them. Their cries blend into the storm, half commands, half laments. Mainstream fact: the Chao Phraya River, the lifeblood of Siam, has always been both gift and threat. Seasonal floods could nourish rice paddies with fertile silt, but when rains swelled too long or too heavy, the same river turned cruel. Chronicles from the Ayutthaya period record years of devastating floods when entire harvests drowned and granary numbers plummeted. Those scribes who once boasted of pyramids of rice were forced to note margins in ink. This year, shortfall. The mud tugs at your ankles as you walk closer to the waterline. Villagers form a frantic chain, passing baskets of wet rice from one hand to another, trying to salvage enough to dry later. Each grain clings together in soggy lumps, heavy with the weight of failure. You smell mildew already setting in, the sour tang of ruined harvests. It's not just food slipping away, it's taxes, trade, temple offerings, diplomacy. Everything you've seen until now leans on rice, and here it is, dissolving into brown water. A quirky tidbit. In some chronicles, people tried to predict the scale of floods by watching the behavior of monitor lizards. If the lizards climbed onto roofs, villagers believed water would rise above the fields, and if they slithered into temples, well, that meant the whole town might end up underwater. Picture yourself relying on the movements of giant reptiles instead of meteorological charts. Honestly, part terrifying, part hilarious. You can almost hear a villager yelling, "Quick! Where's the lizard?" while chaos unfolds outside. Historians still argue whether these flood records were entirely accurate. Some believe scribes exaggerated disasters to explain away shortages in royal stores, shifting blame from bureaucracy to nature. Others suggest the opposite, that records were softened, downplaying the scale of hunger so the kingdom wouldn't look weak. You stand in the rain, staring at villagers sloshing through knee-deep water, and you suspect the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Disasters are rarely just numbers, they're stories shaped for survival. The rain lashes harder, soaking your hair, running down your back. You duck under the eaves of a half-submerged hut, watching families huddle inside. A woman clutches a child, rocking slowly as though rhythm could calm fear. A man pokes at a fire barely clinging to life, trying to dry a bundle of wet rice stalks. Every action here feels desperate, improvised. And yet, in the middle of it all, someone still places a tiny bowl of rice at a shrine shelf, an offering for protection. Even in flood, devotion doesn't drown. You step back outside and watch the river eat its way through the fields. Stalks of rice bend and vanish beneath the surface, waving once before disappearing. The fields look like brown lakes now, dotted with debris. A roof floats by, followed by the carcass of a water buffalo, then an upside-down fishing boat. The scene feels surreal, almost too cinematic, like a disaster film without special effects. Except here, there's no popcorn, just empty stomachs waiting. A soldier on horseback splashes past, shouting orders. He demands villagers record the losses, every sack, every bundle, so scribes can update the ledgers. Even in disaster, the counting doesn't stop. You almost laugh at the absurdity, people scrambling for survival while someone insists, "Don't forget the numbers." But then you realize that's the only way kingdoms survived. Math, even in mud, kept order from collapsing completely. The water rises higher. You retreat onto a hillock, one of the few dry spots. From here, you see lanterns bobbing in the distance, tied to rafts loaded with rescued sacks of rice. Families push them along with poles, moving slowly to safer ground. The lanterns look like tiny stars floating on a muddy sea, fragile but determined. You feel a lump in your throat at the sight. Humanity reduced to flickers of light, protecting their harvest like newborns. Night deepens. The rain finally softens. But the damage is done. The river sprawls across the land like a lazy giant refusing to leave. Frogs croak in the distance, as if mocking the villagers' misery. Dogs bark from rooftops. And in the stillness after chaos, you sense exhaustion blanketing the land. You sit on a rock, pulling your knees close. The air smells of wet earth and despair, yet also of resilience. These people will dry what they can, replant what they must, and record the losses in numbers that will echo through scrolls. You glance at the swollen river and realize it too is part of the kingdom's arithmetic. Sometimes it gives, sometimes it takes, and always, someone is left to count. The swollen river eventually recedes, leaving behind fields that look less like farmland and more like battlefield scars. Mud cracks underfoot as you walk, your sandals sticking, pulling free with a squelch every few steps. The sun is back, glaring hot and unforgiving. And yet the earth doesn't rejoice. Instead of lush green rice stalks waving in the breeze, the paddies are littered with brittle stubble and skeletal fish carcasses. Floods might drown one year, but drought was always lurking to claim the next. The chronicles turn dry too, their language suddenly clipped. Recording famine like a single word could contain the groaning of thousands of stomachs. Villagers trudge across the cracked plains, their shoulders stooped, baskets empty, eyes darting for scraps of edible greens. You feel your own throat dry as dust watching them bend down, plucking weeds from ditch corners and chewing them raw, anything to fool the body into thinking it had rice. Mainstream fact: Siam's monsoon rhythm was never entirely predictable, and prolonged droughts regularly pushed kingdoms to the edge. In Ayutthaya records, famines appear again and again like drumbeats, years when rice stores collapsed and starvation followed. When the rains failed, irrigation canals dried, fields hardened, and the all-important counting of rice became counting of losses instead. A quirky tidbit. In some accounts, people tried grinding palm seeds and mixing them with rice husks to make a rough, bitter porridge. Others chewed boiled tree bark or roasted insects when grain ran out. You can picture someone stirring a pot of bark soup, sighing, "Well, it's technically dinner," while the family pretends to enjoy. Hunger turns creativity into desperation, and yet people clung to the ritual of eating together, even if the meal barely resembled food. Historians still argue whether kings genuinely mobilized aid in these times, or mostly preserved their own granaries. Some scholars believe royal treasuries opened to distribute stored rice, a way to reinforce the king's image as benevolent father of the land. Others insist the poor were largely left to fend for themselves, while royal courts safeguarded their pyramids for festivals and allies. You squint across the parched land, imagining both possibilities. Perhaps both were true, depending on which year you flipped open. The heat presses harder, shimmering in waves. You watch a group of villagers kneel in a circle, hands clasped in prayer, chanting for rain. Their voices are raspy, their skin baked dark, their bodies thin. A child coughs weakly beside his mother. The ground beneath them is cracked wide enough to swallow your foot. You wonder how many prayers dissolved into dry air before one cloud bothered to answer. A faint breeze carries dust into your eyes, and you rub them, blinking at the skeletal remains of a canal. Once a line of life, now it's just a ditch filled with dead frogs. The silence is thick, broken only by the shuffle of bare feet. Every step you take crunches on dry husks. A grim reminder that rice once grew here and might again, if the sky relents. You climb a small ridge where a village once stood. The huts are still here, but many are abandoned, doors hanging loose, mats curled up and brittle. In one hut, you see the remnants of rice jars, empty except for a single cobweb. A lizard scurries across the lid, pausing as though mocking you. Even I have nothing left. You chuckle despite the bleakness, because sometimes sarcasm is the only seasoning left when food is gone. By night, the landscape becomes eerie. With no rice to pound, no meals to prepare, villages grow quiet. Fires burn low, conserving scraps of wood. Bellies rumble audibly in the silence. People lie on bamboo mats, staring at the thatch above, wondering if tomorrow will be worse. And in those still moments, you understand why rice was worshipped, not just eaten. It was life's anchor, and without it, everything drifted toward despair. Some chronicles note odd scenes, villagers holding ceremonies to invite the spirit of rice back into their fields, chanting and scattering flower petals over cracked earth. They spoke directly to the invisible May Fosop, begging her to return, to bless their stalks once more. You imagine the desperation in their voices, halfway between faith and bargaining. It's both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful, the belief that even famine might listen if you asked politely enough. A horse-drawn cart clatters past, loaded with gaunt figures heading toward a larger town, hoping to find relief. Dust kicks up in clouds behind them, hanging like ghosts in the air. You feel the weight of history pressing here, the part that doesn't make it into glorious murals or courtly poetry. Rice wasn't always about abundance or pyramids. It was about aching absence, the hollow echo of bowls never filled. You sit on the ridge as the night deepens, the stars sharp against a sky too clear for rain. Your stomach growls in sympathy with the phantom hunger surrounding you. And yet, beneath the sorrow, you sense resilience. Tomorrow, these people will rise again, scrape together weeds, boil water, share bark soup. They'll whisper prayers into the empty sky, grain by grain of hope against the famine's enormity. The chronicles might just write, "This year, no rice." But standing here, you know the story runs deeper. The sighs, the cracked lips, the children chewing palm seeds. Each famine was not just numbers in a ledger, but nights like this, quiet, heavy, waiting for mercy.
The dry fields fade behind you, and once more you hear the shuffle of sandals, the murmur of men with brushes and ink. You follow the sound into a shaded pavilion where a group of royal scribes sit hunched over long palm leaf manuscripts. Their spines are crooked, their eyes squinting, their fingers stained dark with soot ink. Around them, bundles of dried palm leaves are stacked neatly, waiting to be turned into chronicles. And here, once again, rice takes center stage, not in steaming bowls or flooded patties, but in delicate lines of script, carefully recorded so that the kingdom might remember. The air smells of dried palm fiber, slightly sweet, slightly musty. You settle near the scribes, listening to their murmured recitations as they check each other's work. The scratching of styluses fills the hall, rhythmic, like 100 tiny insects gnawing at wood. One scribe frowns, erases a character with the edge of a shell, then rewrites it, muttering about keeping the numbers straight. You realize that even in the world of ink and parchment, rice grains haunt them, demanding accuracy, mainstream fact. Thai chronicles, especially from the Ayutthaya period, were filled not only with royal battles and alliances but also meticulous records of harvests, floods, and rice taxes. These weren't filler notes, they were central to understanding the state's wealth and stability. A good year of rice often prefaced descriptions of festivals or successful wars. A bad year explained unrest, rebellion, or divine displeasure. One quirky tidbit emerges as you glance at a leaf manuscript. Some scribes decorated the margins with tiny doodles, little elephants, lotus flowers, and even stylized rice stalks. You picture a weary scribe, after hours of counting and copying, sneaking a playful rice doodle into the corner, perhaps thinking, if future historians notice, at least they'll know I had a sense of humor. It's the medieval equivalent of doodling in the margins of your math homework, except here it might be preserved for centuries. Historians still argue whether these chronicles were truly objective records or more like propaganda. Were the numbers and rice tallies accurate, or were they adjusted to flatter kings, to show divine favor? Some scholars claim the scribes inflated yields to make monarchs look competent, while others insist they downplayed abundance to justify new taxes. You tilt your head, watching a scribe's brush hover in hesitation, and realize that every number is already a choice, shaped by fear, loyalty, or convenience. The hall grows warmer as the day progresses, and sweat drips from foreheads onto the manuscripts. The scribes pause to fan themselves with folded palm leaves. One mutters about how hard it is to calculate when his stomach is empty. Another jokes that if he miscounts, he'll be forced to go measure actual rice grains as punishment. You chuckle softly, imagining a royal supervisor dumping a sack of rice in front of him. Count these, and don't come back until you're done. You lean closer to one particular manuscript and read the year's record. Harvest week, floods covered the lowlands, temples received little offering. The phrasing is sparse, almost indifferent, but you know from your own journey what those words hide: the starving families, the cracked earth, the desperate prayers. These chronicles are like skeletons of memory, stripped of flesh, but they still hold the bones of truth. The scribes work in shifts, some copying earlier records to preserve them, others compiling new events. Their voices drone in a half-chant as they read lines aloud. On the 5th month, the river rose. On the 7th month, the king ordered granaries sealed. On the 9th month, no rice was offered in the festival. Each line is precise, detached, as though rice were simply another character in the royal drama. But you know rice was the main actor, even if it pretended to be background. A lizard scuttles across the floor, startling one scribe into smudging his ink. He curses softly, then turns the blot into a flower shape in the margin. Another bursts out laughing, breaking the silence, until the senior scribe glares and shushes them. You smile, realizing even keepers of history had moments of silliness. As human as the farmers in the fields, you stretch your legs and wander toward a shelf where older manuscripts rest. The palm leaves are brittle, their edges curling. You run your fingers lightly over the script and feel the grooves of numbers etched deep, as if the scribes pressed harder when recording shortages, like the urgency left a scar in the leaf itself. In one record, the phrase "the people fled" repeats twice. You pause, thinking of the hunger migrations you saw. The chronicles didn't lie. They just compressed suffering into 3 words: evening comes, and lamps are lit, casting the pavilion in a golden haze. The scribes continue, unfazed by the fading light. A novice boy enters with a tray of rice gruel for their meal. You watch them eat quickly, without ceremony, each spoonful swallowed between lines of script. It's almost poetic, scribes recording rice while living on the thinnest version of it, rice boiled into watery porridge. The kingdom's abundance reduced to a spoonful at a time. As you leave the pavilion, you glance back at the rows of men bent over their work, silhouettes against flickering lamps. The scratching of styluses fades behind you, but the image lingers. The chronicles may seem dry, but in their quiet way, they carried the heartbeat of the land. Grain by grain, number by number, they preserved memory. And as you walk into the night air, you realize those lines, neat or messy, biased or honest, are the reason you can still trace these stories now. The lamplight of the scribes fades, and you step back into the humid night, only to find yourself drawn toward a brighter glow in the distance. It isn't temple torches or palace lanterns, it's the shimmer of fire reflected on polished metal. You approach cautiously and soon see soldiers drilling in the courtyard of a fortress, their spears glinting, their drums pounding. And there, stacked in neat pyramids like the ones you saw at festivals, are sacks of rice, only these aren't for offerings or banquets. They're rations for war. The smell of sweat and iron hangs thick in the air. Soldiers march in lines, their bare feet slapping against packed earth, while officers bark orders that echo off the fortress walls. Beside the training ground, workers lug heavy sacks of rice into storage barns, stacking them carefully to avoid mold. You realize quickly, this isn't just about feeding the hungry. This is about feeding an army, mainstream fact. Wars in Ayutthaya and early Rattanakosin Siam were sustained not by silver or gold but by rice. Campaigns were timed with harvests, and logistics revolved around moving grain as much as moving men. A general who failed to secure enough rice could doom his army before the first spear was thrown. Chronicles often note how entire campaigns stalled because rations ran low or supply lines were cut. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers were actually paid directly in rice instead of coin. Imagine lining up for your paycheck and being handed a sack of grain with a pat on the back. Not exactly convenient for a night out, unless the tavern accepted handfuls of sticky rice as currency. You picture a soldier trying to flirt. "Hey, I can pay for dinner, but only if you're cool with me scooping from my ration bag." Romance on a budget, historians still argue whether rice stores for war were kept primarily for soldiers or whether they doubled as emergency reserves for civilians. Some scholars insist the royal granaries were sacred military property, never to be touched by commoners. Others argue kings strategically released portions during crises to prevent revolt. You look at the guarded barns and see both possibilities: soldiers posted outside with spears, but also villagers occasionally slipping in under supervision to receive aid. The drums beat louder, and you watch a captain stride past the stacks of rice. He pauses to check the tally marks scratched onto bamboo boards, ensuring every sack is accounted for. His face is stern, as though each missing bundle would mean disaster on the battlefield. You realize that here, rice isn't comfort food, it's a weapon, invisible but decisive. A caravan enters the courtyard, ox carts creaking under the weight of fresh sacks. Dusty farmers lead the animals, their eyes wary as soldiers unload the cargo. For the farmers, this rice was sweat and survival. For the army, it's power and conquest. You can feel the tension in the air, a silent tug-of-war over ownership. A child clings to her mother's sarong, watching her family's grain vanish into the barns. No feast awaiting her at home. Inside one barn, the air is stifling with the smell of raw husks. Workers climb ladders, stacking sacks almost to the roof. Each sack is tied with rope, sealed with wax, stamped with royal marks. A soldier counts aloud as each is stored, his voice droning like a monk's chant. 57, 58, 59. It sounds more like prayer than logistics, as though speaking the numbers could keep the army alive outside. Soldiers practice in formation. Their feet pound in rhythm, their spears thrust forward as if piercing invisible enemies. You notice the fatigue in their movements, and then it hits you: many of these men fought on half-empty stomachs. Campaign records mention soldiers eating rationed rice boiled thin, sometimes mixed with river water or wild greens to stretch it further. Hungry men with heavy spears. Not the most glamorous image of an army, but very human. Night falls, and cooking fires spring up in the camp. Soldiers squat in circles, their bronze bowls filled with plain rice and maybe a scrap of dried fish if they're lucky. They laugh, they argue, they slap each other's backs. The sound is warm, familiar, a reminder that even warriors are just people needing dinner. You crouch nearby, watching one soldier lick the bottom of his bowl to catch every last grain. No one mocks him. They all understand. A gust of wind carries smoke upward, and you glance toward the distant horizon. Somewhere out there, enemy armies are marching too, with their own sacks of rice rattling on carts, their own soldiers chewing dry grains. Wars may have been fought with swords, but they were decided by bowls. One soldier pulls out a handful of rice grains from his ration bag and tosses them into the fire, whispering a prayer. You remember the temple offerings, the bowls left for spirits, and you realize even in the army, rice remained sacred. It wasn't just fuel for muscles, it was still a link to gods, ancestors, and fate. The night grows quieter, the clamor of training fading into snores from tents. But the barns remain silent sentinels, filled with the kingdom's lifeblood. You feel the weight of those sacks pressing against history itself. Campaigns would rise and fall with them. Victories would be celebrated, defeats mourned, all measured in grains of rice. You step back into the shadows, leaving the fortress behind. The sound of a lone drum echoes faintly, keeping rhythm with your steps. You can almost taste the bland army rice on your tongue, as though you, too, have become a soldier in this endless campaign where food and war are never far apart. The fortress fades behind you, and you find yourself drifting into a quieter landscape. The clatter of spears, the shouts of soldiers, the scratch of scribes' pens, all dissolve into the softer sounds of night, frogs croaking in the paddies, crickets hidden in grass, the whisper of wind rustling palm fronds. You walk along a raised dike, the moon spilling silver light over fields that stretch endlessly, dotted with the faint glow of oil lamps in village huts. And here, in this calm, you begin to realize what all the counting, hoarding, offering, and rationing was really about. It was never just rice. It was life itself, woven into every corner of the kingdom. Your sandals crunch softly on the dike as you pass families still awake. One hut hums with the sound of pestles pounding rice, steady thuds that echo like a heartbeat. Another spills laughter as children chase fireflies, their bellies probably fuller this year than last. In yet another, an old man sits outside, scattering rice grains in a circle around his hut as a charm against misfortune. You watch him carefully, the way his hand trembles, the way each grain lands with quiet purpose. Mainstream fact: even in modern Thailand, rice remains at the center of culture. It's not just a crop but a daily rhythm, a word tied directly to meal. To ask, "Have you eaten yet?" is to ask, literally, "Have you eaten rice?" That linguistic link traces back through centuries of harvests, floods, offerings, wars, all the stories you've walked through tonight. A quirky tidbit: in some rural traditions, people once placed tiny pillows beside jars of rice, believing the spirit of rice, Mayfosop, needed a place to rest. Imagine tucking in your rice for bed, fluffing a pillow for your grain like it's about to dream. It's strangely sweet, and it makes you wonder if maybe all this time, rice has been caring for people precisely because people cared for rice. Historians still argue whether these countless rituals surrounding rice emerged purely from necessity or whether they shaped Thailand's identity into what it is today. Was rice simply survival dressed in ritual, or did the rituals themselves transform survival into culture? You stroll along the dike, staring at the moonlit paddies, and sense that the answer is both. You can't separate the grain from the story, it's too deeply embedded. The night air cools, brushing against your skin. You pause and kneel at the edge of a paddy, dipping your fingers into the shallow water. Tiny frogs scatter, rice stalks sway gently, and you feel the pulse of centuries in that touch. All those kings, peasants, monks, soldiers, they all touched the same fields in their own way, counting, planting, offering, or hoarding. And here you are, centuries later, dipping your hand into the same story. Far away, you hear a temple bell, soft and low, carrying across the fields. Its sound blends with the rhythm of pestles, the croak of frogs, the distant bark of a dog. It feels like the kingdom is breathing in unison, every sound stitched together by one thread: rice. The bell reminds you of the offerings you saw, the chants, the bowls lined neatly before statues. Even now, you picture villagers rising at dawn, scooping rice into monks' bowls with the same devotion that has never really faded. As you walk further, the fields seem endless, merging with the horizon. The moonlight paints them silver, each stalk glimmering like a thread in an immense fabric. You realize the story of rice in Siam is both grand and ordinary, both spectacular in feasts and quietly tender in daily meals. You chuckle softly at the absurdities you've seen, scribes doodling in manuscripts, lizards predicting floods, soldiers flirting with sacks of rice. And yet, beneath the jokes, the truth remains. Rice shaped kingdoms just as much as kings did. The path grows softer, quieter. Villagers' lamps wink out one by one, leaving the fields bathed in pure moonlight. You slow your pace, breathing deeper, feeling the cool night seep into your bones. The counting, the measuring, the weighing, it all drifts further from urgency into something calmer, like ripples fading across water. You think of all the grains lost and found, swallowed by floods, baked by drought, burned in offerings, scooped into bowls. And somehow, despite every disaster, every shortage, every quarrel about numbers, rice endured. People endured, the air thickens with dew, and your footsteps become muffled, softer. You feel yourself easing into the rhythm of the land itself, as though you too are a stalk swaying in the night breeze. Each breath slows. Each sound fades into a gentle hum. The frog's chorus no longer feels noisy, it feels like a lullaby. You reach a wooden bridge over a canal, and you pause there, gazing at the water. Fireflies hover above the surface, their light blinking lazily. You watch their glow reflected in the ripples, small stars scattered across the earth. It reminds you of the lanterns tied to rice rafts during floods, floating hope through disaster. And it reminds you, too, of the bowls of rice in temples, glowing faintly in candlelight. Patterns repeating, stories circling back, always linked by grain. You exhale slowly, letting the stillness settle deep. The journey has carried you from royal palaces to flooded fields, from temple courtyards to battle camps. You've trudged through mud, sat among scribes, laughed with soldiers, and watched children chase fireflies. And through it all, rice was there, counted, offered, fought over, prayed to. Grain by grain, it has whispered the same lesson. Survival isn't glamorous, but it is sacred, and now, as the night deepens and the stars scatter wider across the sky, you realize it's time to let the story rest, just as the paddies rest before the next planting. The fields lie still, their stalks motionless beneath the stars. You feel the hush of the land settling, the way a blanket settles across a weary body. Each sound softens, the frogs croak slower, the crickets fade to a background hum, even the wind seems to hush itself into silence. The urgency of counting and recording melts away, leaving only the steady rhythm of night. You picture the rice jars tucked safely in village huts, lids closed, families finally asleep. The soldiers, too, have put aside their spears, dreaming with bellies half full but hearts steady. The scribes have lowered their brushes, their ink drying quietly while their heads droop in exhausted rest. The temples glow faintly under moonlight, offerings untouched, incense trails thinning into air. Every corner of the kingdom has fallen silent, held together by the quiet promise that tomorrow will come, and with it, planting, harvesting, and living once again. Your breath slows, matching the cadence of the night around you. Inhale, exhale. The story of rice lingers not as urgency but as comfort, a reminder that life, no matter how precarious, always finds a way forward. The grain that was once counted, feared, worshipped, and fought over now becomes simple nourishment, easing both body and spirit. Let your thoughts drift like the fireflies over the canal, glowing faintly, fading gently. The paddies stretch endlessly into the dark, but you no longer need to walk them. You can rest. You can let the kingdom keep watch while you close your eyes. The rice fields hold you in their quiet embrace, and the night hums softly, like a lullaby you don't need to finish. Sleep now, grain by grain, breath by breath.